All right. Welcome, everyone. This is our first ever edition of This Week in Higher Ed. I'm Mike Palmer, joined, as always, by Dr. Terry Givens. Terry, welcome to our inaugural edition of This Week in Higher Ed.
Absolutely. This is exciting.
It is
And
exciting.
yeah.
Yeah. So we got this show idea together. Terry was on a couple episodes of Trending in Education. We had such a interesting conversation about trends we were seeing in higher ed that we decided there's no better time than right now to launch something like this because it's such a crazy time. Everyone's heading back to school, and or not, and
hmm
that's surfacing a lot of issues. And we thought if we spend time each week kind of reviewing what the issues are together, that's going to be the first part of the hour that we spend together. And then the second part, we're going to do a deep dive on a particular topic. So this week, the topic is going to be tuition discounting. And we have Megan Nocivelli coming on for the second half of this conversation where we're going to go deep on that particular topic. But yeah, and then like Terry mentioned, for those who were on early, you can respond. There's one poll in the polls. If you click on the polls down below, you can respond to the poll that we launched for today's show. You can also choose to ask a question if you want to ask a question Reddit style that people can upvote. You can also ask those questions in the chat, and then we also can bring people on camera and audio, which might be something we do down the road. We'll see whether we get to that at the end of this show. But it is exciting that it's not just going to be us on camera. We'll get other people, hopefully a little more leaned in and engaged. And yeah, I mean we're excited to get this thing kicked off. And I thought we'd begin, Terry, by introducing ourselves and. As our resident expert in all things higher ed, I'll share that I'm less of an insider when it comes to higher ed. I'd love to hear your background and what gets you excited. What are you focused on? Which trends are you tracking? And really kind of your origin story as an educator and as someone who's looking at trends in higher education.
Yes. And yeah, I'm very excited that we're getting this going today, as Mike is. I've been in higher ed for over 20 years. I began my academic career at University of Washington. I then went on to University of Texas at Austin, where I founded the Center for European Studies and then was asked to be a vice provost for undergraduate curriculum and international. Did that for 3 years and stepped back to get promoted to full professor. And once that happened, I went on to be provost at Menlo College. Did that for 3 years. And along the way, realized I really wanted to do something that was more broad, that could really impact higher education, because I could see a lot of the issues, especially having spent some time at a small private college.
Mm-hmm.
And so about a year and a half ago, founded the Center for Higher Education Leadership. And we are in the process of a transition. If you click on our Checkout Brighter Higher Ed link at the bottom, that will take you to higheredleads.com, which is our current website. In the next few weeks, we'll be transitioning over to a new website. But my goal was to deal with a lot of the issues I found that I was facing as an administrator in higher education, which is actually, I always tell people the story. When I became a vice provost, I got called into the provost's office one day. It's like a Friday, and I'm dressed in a t-shirt and jeans. And I walked into the provost's office and all worried that there was something, that's going to happen. And, we just had this discussion, and he offered me the job of vice provost. And always tell people, I looked for the dent in the floor where my jaw hit it. And I was so surprised that they offered this option to me at such an early time in my career. And, the interesting thing is that I was really into the job in the sense that I felt like there was so much, and I did create a lot of change on campus. I mean, I started new majors and so on, but I felt like I didn't know what I was doing half the time.
Yeah.
I was like drinking from a fire hose.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then becoming a provost, I realized, gosh, I don't know enough about accreditation, all these other issues,
Mm-hmm.
just how to be a manager, how to deal with legal issues,
Yeah.
HR, et cetera. So I decided to start the Center for Higher Education Leadership to help leaders make their way through what can sometimes be a minefield, but hopefully is an enjoyable thing to get through. All we do this jobs
Yeah.
because we do these jobs because we care about higher ed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and especially around ed tech, I feel like I've spent the last few years just really digging in and understanding educational technology, where those
Mm-hmm.
trends are going. I've been to tons of conferences. ASU GSV actually is next week for those who are
Yeah.
interested.
Mm-hmm.
ASU GSV is free next week, so
Yeah.
if you're in higher ed, you should be signing up for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a great way to learn what's happening. Salesforce has their higher ed summit every year. So,
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of that and realized, hey, where are all my colleagues?
Right. Right.
They aren't here.
Mm-hmm.
So, so in a sense, what this live cast is really just an extension of what we're doing with what is now going to be Brighter Higher Ed, which is
Mm-hmm.
helping faculty and administrators. It's really to empower, and my goal is really to empower faculty and hired administrators to be able to use all the tools that they can get their hands on to
Yeah.
help higher ed make it through these next few years, which are, it's going to be some critical years. But
Yeah.
we'll jump into that as soon as I let Mike do his introduction.
Yeah. Yeah. And just sort of building on what you're talking about, like my background is more out of the ed tech e-learning space. So I worked at Kaplan Test Prep for 20 years, left in December of this past year. And as part of that, I was in an emerging media R&D role at Kaplan. So I was always trying to stay ahead of the curve in terms of what's emerging. I always like to do the Wayne Gretzky quote, skate to where the puck is going. So I was doing that for many years. And then in 2016, 4 years ago, I launched this weekly podcast called Trending in Education, where we're just tracking what's happening broadly across all the sectors, whether it's higher education. We do a decent amount about lifelong learning and workforce development, future work. We also touch on K-12, really just about anything, ed tech, emerging technology. But I was really happy to get this opportunity to partner with Terri to go deeper on a particular sector. And because higher ed historically had been one of the sectors that we thought was going to change slower than others, at least that had been the track record, where, typically I was looking for the emerging trends in really workforce development, future of work. A lot of organizations were thinking more nimbly and agilely about implementing their changes. Universities and higher education tended to move slower, as did K-12. And then COVID happened, and some of the slower movers, some of the more ensconced institutional players in higher ed and K-12 suddenly were forced to adopt change, forced to adopt technology, and that's really made the focus of trending in education and a lot of my interests shifted more to higher ed and more to these types of topics that we're going to be talking about on this show. And I'm really happy to have Terri here and the audience here who may have some more depth when it comes to higher ed. So I'm going to be a little more the outsider, a little more of the moderator, and hopefully I'll be able to bring in some trends around emerging technology and some trends around learning science and e-learning, which is something I've really been passionate about for the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and then with that, I think we wanted to kick off with some of the topics that are emerging, which if you look at the poll that we shared, COVID on campus is getting the most votes, followed by tuition discounting and diversity, equity, and inclusion. No love yet for the notorious RBG.
Yeah, what's the deal, folks? RBG.
RBG, but maybe, there we go. Thank you, voter.
Okay. Actually, I'm going to vote too.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I think we wanted to start really with the top vote getter. Although look at the dynamic movement. This is very exciting. This is why live is so exciting. But I think we wanted to begin at least with a few moments on COVID itself, right? So in the chat, you can see the second link that Terri shared at the top is a CNN article about colleges and universities reopening with COVID, the whole COVID on campus. I've been looking at the New York Times a lot, which has been doing really good case tracking, historically more just about states and countries. Just within the last month, they began tracking cases on campus. Mm-hmm. And and that's where they've reported as many as I think just today I was looking, it looked like 88,000 cases.
Right.
I think in the CNN article here, it listed it as closer to
40,000.
40,000.
Yeah.
But it's clearly a moving target, and the takeaway is that the number is very big, and in a lot of ways, COVID is really what brought us together to a certain extent. Like I think there's been much more focus on these types of formats. It's the year of the webinar, the year of the Zoom backdrop, hopefully the year of the learning podcast. But yeah, I'd love to get maybe some of your initial thoughts, Terri, on COVID and on what's been so transformative about it, and where we see that, what's emerging in the last week or so that's sort of top of mind for you, and feel free to weigh in the chat, folks, too. Like if you have any topics related, we're going to begin with COVID. I think we'll probably then transition a little more into Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Talk a little bit about the NCAA and college sports, because that's also a place where football was announcing college football is coming back in some capacity. But and then we'll bring our guest in. But just to kick it off, Terri, any initial thoughts on COVID on campus?
Just a few.
Yeah, I
imagine. No, it's transformative. I mean, I hate, we've all been using these superlatives as unprecedented, but actually transformative, I think, is what people are really starting to latch on to now, is that we're kind of past that initial, okay, we're going to get the semester started. We're seeing a lot of cases, the CNN, I like that CNN article because it talks about, and a lot of people have been talking about the fact that, we're asking students to change their behavior. And it really comes down to saying, okay, and some people are complaining that, well, these campuses and their administrators are blaming the students. Because they're not able to do, what we're asking them to do. And but I've also seen some pushback from, I'm very active. So if you're on Twitter, or Facebook or LinkedIn, I'm very active on all those platforms because I'm trying to kind of keep track of, what I have a lot of friends who are on the faculty and who are administrators and so on. I'm trying to keep track. What are the people on the ground saying? And, I saw one of my faculty colleagues saying, well, what we're asking the students to do is not that hard. We're saying, they one of the things about college is we are training students not just on the basics of English and math. We're training, this is the time when they have to become adults, right? And so we're asking them to focus not on the parties and all that. We're asking them to focus on their education and keeping everybody safe. And is it really that much to ask from the students? So I think there's a debate developing around there about, what is the responsibility of the students and what can we expect from them? And obviously there's all the research that talks about, the formation of the frontal lobe or whatever it is. I'm not an expert on that. And thanks, Kathy, for that comment. She says we should all remember when we were defiant young people. And imagine, if you come from a family that's saying we're not going to wear masks, that's an infringement on my ability to, or my free speech and so on. Then, as a student, you're going to, why is, you don't want to necessarily do all that. So, I think we're going to have this ongoing discussion about whether institutions should have opened, should they stay open? Should they be completely online? I know I'm also dealing, actually one of the things I was going to mention is, I also believe in the overlap between, K through 12 and higher ed. And I have a son who's a junior in high school, and I'm watching his, situation where, his school just announced that they're going to be the full semester on online. And we're seeing some institutions are saying they're going to be online for the most part for the year. So in any case, it's a really interesting balance. And I feel for every single faculty member and administrator, anybody who's dealing, anybody in higher ed right now. We're all struggling with
Yeah,
this because
and also parents too, right? So
yes,
like
absolutely.
family,
Oh,
students, everyone is struggling
well,
nowadays.
I'm a college student parent too,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's interesting. I'm on the Facebook page for my son's college, and I as an administrator, I just cringe at times because I'm like, oh, but you don't understand what the administrators are going through.
right,
But as a parent, I'm like, yes, stick it to those administrators.
right, right. Well, and it does feel like parents are even more involved in their children's educational pathway beyond, move-in day. Now, if move-in day isn't happening, which generally speaking it's not, if students aren't even going to campus, then they're studying at home.
Hmm.
Like you're living in the same space with your kid as they go to college.
Yeah.
It's a very different context. I did want to hear from your perspective, hear from you on your perspective, Terri, also as someone who's been an administrator. I know you have some thoughts on the types of campus life and size of universities
Yeah.
that should be able to manage this versus bigger schools. So
Mhm.
can you share a little bit of that? I know we talked about that a bit on the podcast.
Yeah, and my take on it is if you're under 5,000 students and you're not 100% residential, it can actually be pretty manageable. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing that with my son's college, Lewis and Clark, in Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the bigger issue they had this past week was the smoke. We had the smoke
Right.
here in
Exactly.
California as
Yeah.
well, and
Mm-hmm.
so you had COVID and smoke at the same time.
Right.
But they've had I think they've had a total of 3 cases, and they're doing
Mm-hmm.
the effluent testing.
Yeah.
And the thing is, from what I hear from my son is, they're staying in their pods, they're wearing
Yeah.
masks, they're
Mm-hmm.
they're they're eating outside, they're doing all these things. And some kids aren't enjoying it and they're going back home.
Right.
Some kids are okay. My son seems to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when his institution has about 2,000 students, a little over
Yep.
2,000.
Yep.
And I do, and actually, I've been out there talking about this on LinkedIn. I think we need to start talking about the situations where it is doable.
Right.
Now, I think the bigger institutions are going to struggle.
Mm-hmm.
The UNCs, the Notre Dame has.
Yep.
I love Brian Alexander's. He calls it the
Yeah. His
toggle
toggle term.
term.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that, right? We're having institutions having to shut down for weeks at a time, and some are deciding to keep the students in the dorms because you don't
Mm-hmm.
want all these students with who potentially
Yeah.
have COVID going out
Take it
into the
home with them. Yeah.
community.
Mm-hmm.
Or do we anyway? There's different ways to deal with it, and
Yeah.
and I guess what's kind of interesting, I was talking about this with a colleague from the UK, is that we don't have there's no minister of education
Right.
who is telling all the campuses how to
Mm-hmm.
handle this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other aspect of it, is that I feel very much for these administrators because they're working with their local health,
Right.
uh, you know whatever the health.
Authority.
Thank you. Yes, health authorities.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're working with their local health authorities and trying to figure out what are the guidelines. And that's true even at K through 12. Every school district is working with their local health authority to
Yeah.
figure out what are the rules we have to follow. Now, California has state level rules
Right.
for opening both college and
Yeah.
K through 12
Yeah.
campuses.
Yeah.
And but also there's some local tweaks to that
Right.
and at the county level. And so I think that it's really interesting to see how people not people, they're people, but administrators are having to juggle all the different demands. And that's what the CNN article talks about, right?
Yeah.
It's like how, and there's the whole other layer of politics, which is coming into
Sure.
it. And that,
Right.
I think that'll help us make the nice transition into Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, politics is always a part of, the decision-making process. You have members of the boards of trustees who are, sometimes political appointees when it comes to public institutions. And they're responding to what the governors want, and the governors are responding to what the president wants. And so there's all these different layers of pressure and expectations that are impacting, and including parents and students, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's fraught. It's a fraught time. Everyone's on edge, so we definitely empathize, and we're probably gonna cover this in more depth over the next 10 weeks. So the idea of this show is like we're gonna do a first run of it really now through Thanksgiving ish, just before Thanksgiving, now through the middle of November. Each week we'll be covering another topic, different topics in depth. One that we'll likely come back to in multiple
every
different
week.
dimensions is COVID, and
Mhm.
even bring in some experts who can provide some additional perspective on it. But we'd also love to hear from folks who are attending, and also hear from folks around what what angles you want us to pursue. As hopefully this will be an evolving conversation where we're getting input from folks out there, and it's also been a place where mental health, I think, has come very much to the forefront as
Yeah.
well, where like just the anxiety that everyone's facing, the decision stresses that whether you're an administrator, a student, a parent, just a faculty member who now may have to teach in person or may have to learn to teach online. Higher ed is being thrust into a lot of change, and a lot of different directions in which we can cover that. But COVID really has been the driver on that. So one that we'll continue to cover on this podcast, so this webcast,
Live cast. We're calling it a live
live
cast.
cast, live cast. There you go. But then we did want to give Ruth Bader Ginsburg her due as well, and talk about her legacy. So there is an article that we'll share in the chat as well that does talk about her impact on education, particularly from the perspective of opening up access, where her perspective on the Constitution is that from the time that it was written till now, the history of the court, in particular, has been expanding what was very limited access to rights that were protected in the Constitution. And Title IX and gender equality was a real key decision that, as a relatively early in her career, she was, or late in her career, depending on how you look at it. Another thing for her, just the fact that
She
she
had a
was,
very long career.
oh my God. I mean, I hope I'm doing that in my 80s. My goodness.
Yeah.
But Terri, I know Title IX was something, just in terms of your personal story, you had a really interesting and powerful post on LinkedIn about this, where as someone who really was an athlete, and by virtue of an athletic scholarship was able to go to Stanford. I'd love to hear you expand a little bit on that and on the post that you shared earlier in the week.
Yeah, and actually, I wasn't on an athletic scholarship, but I
There you
still
go.
had a scholarship. I did get recruited to run track at
There you
Stanford.
go.
Yeah, so at Stanford, I was there undergrad, and actually, I mean, it was partly the reason I ended up at Stanford was because of the recruitment by the track coach. So,
Mhm.
I mean, that certainly helped me because first generation college goer, I didn't really know what I was doing when I was applying to college. Although
Yeah.
I did have I will give a shout out to Gonzaga Prep, because I did have a lot of good support from actually they were the ones who connected me and the track coach. It's interesting. I was going through some of my old papers and found a letter that I got from the track coach. But anyway, Title IX. So if you're on LinkedIn, go check out. I posted a video that was done a couple of years ago by somebody who works for the company Title IX. But the impact of Title IX on me is incalculable, because I was one of the first generations of women who really got to take advantage of it from the perspective of having actual sports teams to be on. My sisters are older than me, and they didn't have the same opportunities that I had in sports. And I talk about that in the video, of course. But to be honest, until I watched the movie and I didn't really understand Ruth Bader Ginsburg's influence on Title IX and all of these different things. I mean, people have been posting, if you can, all these different things you can do because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's work. And so for me, Title IX was huge. I was able to compete in sports and to have that experience and to have that access. And we see the impact of Title IX to this day. I mean, basically the fact that they have to maintain, equality for women's and men's sports in the colleges has just had a huge impact on opportunities for women. So, but on the other hand, and I'm going to transition into another article we were looking at, I do have issues with the NCAA more generally.
Yes.
And, the way they've been, and it ties in with the whole COVID issue, right? We're seeing, the football is coming back, and, there's been, protests around Black Lives Matter and football and so on. And, I think, I know sports is something Mike
Yeah.
likes to talk about.
I do.
So, I think another thing we're going to do is kind of keep track of this. I want to keep track of what's happening with the football teams and how this is playing out. And, the Pac-12 is talking about starting up in early November.
Right. Because they went in the opposite direction of a toggle, right? They originally, them and the Big Ten said they weren't going to have their fall season, and now the Big Ten is back, and I think the Pac-10 is likely coming back as well.
Pac-12,
right?
Pac-12.
Pac-12, excuse me, showing my age there. Yeah.
I know. It's taken me years to figure that out, but they're. I mean, I don't know if there's been an official announcement yet from the Pac-12, but over the weekend they were saying, the first week in November, but that's very much it's I'm sure there's a lot of pressure from the broadcasters in terms of so I mean there's all these different pressures that are coming to play, and are we really doing the best that we can by these students? And we'll see how it goes.
And not to mention, those big campuses are the ones that have the sports programs that are going to be playing again. So the Pac-12 and Big Ten are campuses where if the regular student body is there and the athletes are there, they're going to mix, and when they mix, they're going to spread the virus. And then they're also traveling and they're playing contact sports. So you can kind of do the math on that, but it's likely that we're going to see more, and that's another story, another thread that we'll be tracking throughout the fall. And then we did want to also bring in our guest around tuition discounting. But were there any other trends that you wanted to make sure we touched on as we're kicking off? Otherwise, I can bring Megan on.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much those are the main ones. I mean, obviously, we'll be talking a lot more about these issues going forward, and I feel like this is a great opportunity. So if you guys have questions, not only can we address it today, but also if you think of things that you would like us to address later, feel free to reach out. Or if you have ideas for future people you would like us to have on the live cast.
So I've invited Megan. Megan is joining us.
Yes. Hi, Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just a note, Terrence has posted an email if you guys want to send us any suggestions or ideas for future live casts. But welcome, Megan. I'm so excited to have you.
Hi, thanks. Glad to be here. It was great to hear your conversation earlier, all the hot topics in higher ed right now.
Yeah. Any of them jump to mind before we get into your specific domain of expertise?
Well, I'm always interested in I was a college athlete myself, Division III, and I'm the faculty athletic rep here at Nichols College. So I'm always interested in the NCAA and Title IX. So yeah, I'm going to be interested to see how that all works out too.
Yeah, for sure. But your area of expertise specifically is around tuition discounting, and that's where we wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive with you. So can you introduce for our audience your angle into tuition discounting and some of the research that you've done? Because it's really interesting, and I think it's also a topic that again, as someone who's not as deeply swimming in higher ed, from the outside, it's not always a topic that necessarily resonates, but it's really important and really interesting once you dig in. So can you introduce the topic for our audience? Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I decided to look into this topic for my dissertation a few years ago. So, and I came to academia. This is a second career for me. So I came to academia from business. So I've always looked at this organization, any organization on the whole. So as we started to hear things a few years ago about the reduction in the number of students, just the number of traditional students that were going to be coming out of high school, and then the skyrocketing, 80% increase in tuition over the last 10 or 15 years, with at one point a smaller increase in household incomes. But then after the Great Recession, that's really been flat. So we're dealing with this, as everyone knows, we're dealing with this enormous increase in college tuitions and overall basic flat increase in household income. So the question becomes how is everyone going to afford this? And the discounting that tuition that colleges are able to offer was really supposed to level the playing field originally for those in the lower socioeconomic brackets, right? But and this is previous to the last 3 or 4 years, and certainly previous to COVID. Colleges started using those discounts really to get a particular student, a student that had a particular skill that they needed or could add to their community in a certain way, as opposed to strictly for the lower socioeconomic students. So there's that's what interested me. It's like there's more here than I can read in the newspaper. And I work at a small private business, predominantly business college in New England. So certainly selfishly my interest was how are small private colleges in New England and beyond going to survive the next 5 to 10 years until we can see that another 5 years from now, we're going to start to have an uptick in the number of students coming out of high school. But as we all know, too, not everybody's going to make it.
Right.
So not everybody, that's struggling now is going to be around to, receive those students in another 5 or 6 years. Yep. So that's how I got interested in it, and that's how I started my research.
Right. And your research was pre-COVID too. So
yes.
some of the trends around, the enrollment cliff that folks were seeing in the middle of the 2020s, you're starting to see that now, not because of demographics, but more because folks are opting out of that first year of college, at least. The idea of the Corona gap year is something that I'm hearing more and more folks talk about.
Right.
So in some ways, just like we were talking during the open, some of these trends that might have been for 3 or 5 years down the road, those small private colleges are going to feel more of that enrollment crunch this year, heading into next year. And some of the reasons why they do tuition discounting, I'd be curious from your perspective, how will COVID influence the extent to which folks are discounting? Are they going to start discounting more or less? Any initial perspective on that?
Sure. Well, from what what I'm observing from my research, and then now what I'm observing, all of these problems, and Terri can certainly attest to that, were there. So what COVID has done is sped this up like a 4 to 5 year. We've jumped ahead 4 or 5 years into the depth of the problem that would have taken us 4 or 5 years to reach with COVID. So all the problems, were on the horizon, and most colleges, have seen them coming and have started to reduce spending and not rehire after attrition and things to prepare. But then this really catapulted everyone right into the middle of it. So the another thing that's kind of interesting as far as how colleges are going to fare is that this discounting that is offered there's no difference between a well-known brand college with and that usually correlates to very high endowment and a large percentage of alumni giving. There's no difference there in the amount that they're giving or they're allowed to give, that kind of thing, to the smaller, less selective colleges that don't have the big brand names. So when you start talking about tuition price and tuition discounting, it becomes far more important for the low, the less selective colleges that don't have that big brand name to rely on.
Right.
So and there's been another thing that I kind of found in my research too, is that particularly in the household incomes of about 100 to 150,000, which is a big income area for Nichols College, from 75 to like 150 and some up to 200. There's been since the Great Recession, there's been a real level of consumerism that has been brought forward into searching for your higher ed experience, right? They used to be sort of preserved for buying a car, buying a house, and then buying your child this 4-year experience that's going to change their lives. It's going to catapult them into this other sphere. We hope this other earning potential, those kinds of things. For for a school like mine and for the income levels that we primarily deal with, there is a real consumerism. What exactly am I going to get for my money? So colleges need to respond to that. They need to really be able to identify their competitive advantage and then really market to that competitive advantage. Because if we just keep marketing on, and not that Nichols is, but small colleges in general, keep marketing on and pushing that the discount, it's not sustainable, as we know. So on average last year, colleges were between 50 and 52 discount rate. And not everybody knows that. If you've been through the process before with a child, you're kind of hip to that. But if you have not been, if this is your first time through the process and you're looking at sticker prices, which is the price, the high price that's on a college website, you don't know that you're right off the bat, you're going to pay 50% of that. Right. College counselors are becoming more and more savvy and are very savvy. And I think are spreading that word more and more to their students. And many colleges are also putting on even a payment calculator, putting that right on the website where you put in your household income and a few other variables, and it's going to give you pretty close. It's going to give you a pretty close number to where you're going to pay. So I think more and more people are becoming aware of it, but not everybody. And that was part of my research. I thought most people were going to say, "Oh yeah, of course I know. I'm not going to pay full sticker price." I was very surprised at the number of people who thought they were going to pay full sticker price.
But Megan, isn't it also that, and I've heard this from admissions people, is that they feel like keeping that higher price is, it helps them show that they're an elite institution.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's definitely the case. And that's been, I think, why some colleges have resisted lowering their price, and not lowering their price, but making it more obvious, or announcing, even coming out with a tuition reduction plan, that we've restructured our tuition and we understand how difficult it is for families. And we're not going to pretend we're 70,000 and when we know you're going to pay 35, we're going to come right out and tell you it's $35,000 to go to school here. The big concern is, what does that say about the quality of the education? So that was one of the things I wanted to know, because I think that is a normal response. If I see a college is 50% off, so to speak, you might, I think it's a normal response to say, what's going on there? Like, is this, what's going on? So that was one of the things I tested in my research, was what is the correlation between a reduction in tuition and the quality of the education? And it's interesting. I did it at a 10%, a 25%, and a 50% price reduction. And at the 50%, it was the best correlation. They appreciated the impression of the quality of the education, and the school itself went up at the 50%.
Interesting.
So that told me that at 50%, people are saying, okay, thank you. I can really get on board with this. I could afford this. And I think there was a positive feeling about a college being straight with them. But I know that there is there is just sort of, I think, somewhat of an uneducated perception that if the price of the school goes down, the quality is going down. Right. And the most important factor was job placement. So the most important, I looked at 5 elements that I would consider quality of the education. So job placement rate, the education of the faculty and the scholarship of the faculty, things like that. And the most important element to my potential, the potential customers that I surveyed was the job placement rate by far.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting, because I remember when I was at University of Texas, and I was working on developing some new degree or really majors. We found basically the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board was requiring us to say, what kind of a job can students get if they get a degree in government or political science? And we were like, whoa, is that really our job to say which kind of jobs they can get? And it's becoming job, right? That's the reality. I know my faculty friends out there will resist it when we say, students are customers, but in a sense, parents are customers, right?
They're definitely. We definitely have 2 segments as a college. We have 2 market segments: students and parents. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And No, go ahead, Mike.
Well, and COVID is bringing them closer together in this conversation.
Yep.
I did just want to hit quickly, because this was another one that was another thing that was news to me, is the role of international students. Subsidizing the discounting was something I didn't really know as much about. Can you expand on that?
Sure. Well, typically international students pay full price. So when you lose, if you lose a domestic student, you're losing 50% of your tuition or your discounted rate. When you lose an international student, you're losing 100%. And, conversely, every time you bring in an international student, again, by and large, you're getting 100% of the tuition, the sticker price paid. So for schools that have that traditionally have a high international population, like Northeastern or Boston University, that has been a major hit for them. Some smaller rural schools aren't as dependent. They're tuition dependent, but they're not necessarily international student dependent. So it hasn't hit them as much. That's really where a school like a BU or Northeastern, that's where they've taken their biggest hit, is in their international population.
And I would imagine, they're not, if you're in China, you're not going to study online at BU. You're just not going to go to BU, right? It's different.
Well, there's been both. Yes, agreed. Because there is such a time difference. So to be live with classes, but some schools are offering a discounted rate if you're fully online. So to still keep you enrolled as a student and to prevent you from going somewhere else and then saying, "Oh, I'll just stay there."
Right.
Let's keep you on board here. And if you want to do a few classes online during this period, we'll give you a discounted rate, and then hopefully you'll be back with us full time in January.
Because that will be an interesting trend to watch too, as because a lot of, I know in New York City public schools, for example, it's getting close to 50% of parents are just choosing online learning rather than sending their kids to campus.
Rather than risking it, even when they had the option. Yeah. And it's interesting with the COVID too, that a school like Nichols, we've had zero. I saw Maury Pelto posted in the chat that we've had, 3 weeks in a row of zero positives. So as people are looking for schools to go back to, if they've taken a gap year, then looking at some of the smaller rural colleges makes a lot of sense at this point.
Yeah. It reminds me, again, and I'll give Terri more room from this point, but it does remind me a little bit of the NBA bubble, which has proven to be successful, but it's partly because it's small numbers, a controlled campus. It does seem like the profile of some of your smaller private colleges like Nichols. So anyway, Terri, it's all yours.
That's fine.
Yeah, and I would say too that the students, we don't have a large off-campus population here, and I think that's where you're getting into some difficulty. Our students that live here live on campus. We have, 1 or 2 houses for some athletes off campus, but we don't have a big off-campus population like Providence College has run into trouble with that, and Holy Cross here in Worcester ran into trouble with that. So we don't have a big off-campus population, and our students, I didn't see this coming, but our students are really encouraging each other and pressuring each other to do the right thing because they don't want to go home.
Right, I imagine.
Which I understand.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's totally true. I'm seeing it in a lot of, that's why I was saying in the chat, I'm really interested in looking at the colleges who are doing it right. And a lot of these small camp, it's funny because, when we look at the numbers, they're really at the bigger campuses, right? University of Florida, UNC, et cetera. But, what I'm really focused on the small private colleges, because of course, as you're saying, they're in danger. We're going to lose some of them. And, I've got an initiative, saving 100 private colleges because they're critical to our infrastructure of higher education.
Right.
And, I'm constantly saying, if you're on LinkedIn, I'm posting stuff all the time about this because we really do have to save these colleges because so many students who come from, first generation, those who need that smaller campus, residential campus climate who are going to perform better. I think a lot of not every student, but there's a certain segment of students who we know are going to do better on a small liberal arts college campus.
That's right.
We really need to find a way to save them, and it's going to take innovation. I mean, we've been talking about the problem. So, Megan, I'm wondering what your thoughts. I mean, one solution we're pursuing at Brighter Higher Ed is this idea of alliances and getting these small colleges to work together and cut some of the costs so that they can cut, we're talking about tuition. We need to cut tuition. It's not just about going down to the level of the discount rate, but being able to survive at that discount rate and just charge that discount rate, right? So yeah, so go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I think alliances are great. I think going outside and getting help, or just sort of helping each other particularly at this time, the alliances don't have to last forever, right? I mean, we have to get through this period of time. So whether we're allowing students to take each other's courses online or in person, and we create these alliances. But I'm also a fan, I guess, because I came from the business side, of going out and getting some sponsors, getting a sponsor for, an incubator, a corporate sponsor for an incubator lab, things like that. And then certainly it's the time for, alumni. If you've ever thought about giving to your college, now is the time, So any of those ways that we can bring in, I just look at all different revenue streams for small colleges. What are all the different revenue streams? And then increasing this online learning. It's the overhead. Once we've paid for the overhead, we've paid for the infrastructure. Every single time we get another online student, it's money to the bottom line, right?
Right.
I'm laughing at Paul's comment because he's saying his office is down the hall from Megan's.
Yes. Yeah.
I appreciate that question. After World War II, we went into this period of physical expansion. With more residence halls. I think, and there's another question from Terrence, but I'll come to that in a minute. But, I do think we're facing a time when colleges have to rethink the model. I do think we're going to see more online teaching, partly because, it can allow for more accessibility. If I'm a student and, I have an issue, it helps if I can go back and, do my class asynchronously that week, and I may be back synchronous the next week.
Right.
There's so many aspects of this that make sense. And so how do you do that? Well, I think it's really important. And yes, Kathy, HBCUs, I'm all about HBCUs. They have to survive. And we want to help them survive. Actually, I'm offering free services to HBCUs. So if you know someone who needs some help, I'm out there. But I do think we need to rethink the model. It's all about innovation. It's about using the tools, the best tools that are available, and using each other as if there's any time when higher ed needs to come together and figure out how we can work together. This is it. We don't have that Minister of Education up there who's telling us or pushing us to work together. So we have to do it ourselves.
Right. And the growth is in the non-traditional student, right? So, offering the online option for the non-traditional student, right? The adult going back to school, and some of the minority groups too. That seems to be the best way to offer, accessibility, a reasonable price, and then the opportunity for people to be working and going back to school at the same time. Seems like, again, from my research, that was where there seemed to be a lot of growth potential for higher ed.
And the other thing that I think COVID will push us towards is more the concept of low residency, like learning pods, which is a macro trend you're seeing across all sectors, where a small group, a cohort of 20 or 30, and just even thinking about the socialization function that college life provides to all of us who have the opportunity to pursue it, it does seem like there are some advantages to that model where, like, if I'm going to develop deeper ties to, say, 20 or 30 students who are going to be part of my pod, and then that group will be on campus maybe less than a full semester, just to be safer in terms of COVID. And then there's more use of online. Like, so it does feel like these new models are formulating, and it does sound like the financial crisis that many colleges are facing is going to be a real impetus to be more innovative. So a lot of a lot of what I've seen from you, Terri, is like, let's be more let's break the mold, let's try some new things. And now it's like innovator die, it seems, to a certain extent.
Agreed. Yeah, and let's not just try to wait it out so we can go back to the old way, right? Let's not just try to limp along. Right. So I hope not. I think there's a lot of great opportunities, especially, we keep talking about accessibility, a lot of opportunities for more access if we can continue to innovate and move forward that way.
Yeah.
I agree. And, Megan, what you're talking about ties into the future of work, which I know is a big interest of mine.
Yeah,
and it's what we were talking about before. It's like, we need to be more open to connecting how are we connecting to work for students? I mean, we obviously know that the students we're training today are going to have completely different careers 20 years from now.
Right.
So we have to make sure we're doing those things that are effectively training them to be agile, to be ready to make that career change, to be, have to have good writing and communication skills and quantitative skills and
problem solving.
Right. Problem solving is, huge. Project-based learning, all of those things are out there and are ready to be utilized. And, the problem I have with higher ed is, we aren't teaching our graduate students this stuff. and we need to be teaching our graduates. And I'm not saying that's 100% across the board.
Right.
But, for the most part, we aren't really doing that well.
And as part of a differentiation here at Nichols, that's been a big part of our differentiation is we have every class has some sort of an experiential learning component. So whether you work for an actual company, under the, the direction of your professor or, case studies, but primarily we really do try to get some community businesses in or, all of us that used to be in business before we taught, reaching out to all of our colleagues and getting the students involved in actually solving problems and working on cases and things. So when they get out, whatever that situation is going to be, when they get out into work, we don't know what it's going to look like, but they have a structure for going through and analyzing information and coming up with alternatives and coming up with solutions.
Yeah, and there is a question I want to come back to. What is the correlation between reduced cost and increased miscellaneous fees? And can a school effectively hide costs with a tuition discount made up with fees, like an airline pricing structure?
I don't know the answer. That's not my school is private. So I feel like that's more
that's happening more in public schools. Yeah.
Public schools. Where the tuition rate is very reasonable. And then it's
they charge a lot of fees. I saw that actually it was interesting when I was at UT Austin, we actually tried to move away from that model and just have flat rate pricing. And so we got rid of a lot of the fees, but then that kind of came back to bite us when the legislature said we had to, we couldn't raise our tuition and we said we had flat rate tuition and we couldn't add. So I think they have started adding fees.
And they have to start on the fees. Yeah.
Well, sometimes you have no choice. There's certain things that,
the cost. Yeah. Labs and things like that. They're, very expensive to run and and not everyone uses them. So if you're using a particular lab, whether it be in a nursing program or something like that, there's a cost associated with that.
Yeah. I'd love to get a little of your perspective, Megan, too, on the other disruptive force that's out there, which is the Googles and the Amazons and the corporations that are saying we can train prospective employees without them having to go. Google made a lot of noise recently announcing their projects. It sounds like Nichols is more moving in that direction through a partnership, like with the private sector, but I'd love to hear you expand a little more on that.
Sure. Well, to answer your question, I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, I don't think it should replace higher ed. It certainly wouldn't have replaced my higher ed experience, and certainly for my children, I don't want it to replace their higher ed experience. But I understand what they're saying, that, people in those businesses need to have such very specific skills that regardless of where they come out of college, some of these companies have to sort of train them anyway. And they're saying, we could train them all together. But we all know there are some things that we learn at college that, that aren't on the brochure, right? So we learn time management, we learn how to problem solve, we learn how to get along with people. And part of, experiential learning too is working in groups, right? And having to come to agreement. Everyone has to get together. Everyone has to use time management. Someone's a leader, someone's a follower. And then next time, hopefully someone else is the leader and someone else is the follower. Right. So there's a lot of that. And then simply critical thinking, problem solving, and looking outside maybe just the information you've been given. Sometimes that's enough, but to be able to look at things in your writing courses where you're learning to look at things critically and problem solve, that isn't, I don't see that as part of those curriculums from a Google a Google Ed or something like that. But another thing that I do think is a great resource or could help us all is the open resources.
Yes.
So, you know, that now to me, that is a great combination with whatever education, you know, a small private school or another school to be using those open resources. And I'm sorry to the public publishing companies, but something's got to give, and I don't want it to be higher ed. So, but using those, I mean, I've used some open resources. They're great, you know, and then as our students gets older, we rely more on either open resources or case studies, or our own, you know, our own consulting projects with businesses. So that works really well for us. So that's a good, for me, that's a nice combination of the open resources, but still under the direction of, you know, a professor with particular learning outcomes that we're after, and still getting that residential college experience and education, like I said, that's not necessarily in the brochure.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, it sort of ties into the question Kathy's asking, that we have to figure out how best to work with students who don't do well with virtual learning. You know, some are doing better with virtual learning, while some who are better with in-person learning are doing worse. So you know, we're seeing that tension and that struggle, which is why I think, you know, going to a hybrid approach, it makes a lot of sense. You know, figuring out which students, you know, one of the things that's we're seeing is another trend is actually looking at how students are doing in, you know, different types of learning environments. We can get that data. We can figure out, you know, how is this person doing in this kind of class versus that kind of class? You know, how we can look at assessments, we can do all these things. And, you know, I think we need to be more systematic in higher ed about doing this and figuring out, okay, if we can only have 10 students in the classroom, let's figure out who those 10 students should be and go from there. So,
and I think a related point there is the problem of digital inclusion. Where not every, like, underrepresented students, low socioeconomics, that, you know, online is a nice band-aid, but not everybody can apply it. So how do you reach those students who also have they have more need on meeting their tuition as well? So like, how do you actually get them on campus? Because the other challenge, you know, which ties to the diversity and inclusion piece, is that if you don't get those students on campus, you start having a more monolithic, non-diverse
which you don't want.
Which sort of undermines the whole promise of what you were describing, Megan. Like, part of the intangibles of being on campus is being exposed to people who aren't like you, who come from different backgrounds.
That's right.
And that works in all directions, both the kids who are coming from a privileged background as well as the kids who are underserved.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and letting them self-select, which I think in COVID, because, you know, all of this was thrust on everyone, so people are making quicker decisions. Letting students self-select is great, I think, for retention and things. But going forward, Terri, like when you're talking about, would be sort of a long-term hybrid model. I don't know that, you know, letting students self-select is the best way to go.
No, I think we.
Oops, there you are.
And your hands, we saw your hands the whole time. So I don't know what happened, but something happened. Yeah.
Well, that was a weird thing. But anyway, I was going to say, I think, you know, if we think about kind of, I would love just for us to spend more, and maybe we'll spend a whole session on this, like, you know, what are some of the teaching and learning best practices that can help us in this kind of situation? You know, if we're going to look towards the future and figure out what's the best environment for students, and it's obviously the more individualized we can get and say this student needs X, Y, and Z, but we also want them to have exposure to a broader range of other students and faculty and so on. I mean, you know, it's a matter of, you know, combining different best practices, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. That's why I really push for collaboration. And there's a lot of that going on. You know, I don't want to say that there isn't any of that going on. You know, actually, you know, I'm on a couple of Facebook pages where faculty are just coming on, you know, pandemic pedagogy and, you know, talking about what they're doing and how they're, you know, and it's a lot of struggle right now. And, you know, so you know, Mike mentioned the wellness component. You know, I do think we all need to acknowledge this is a really stressful time. But leaders have to be thinking about how this is going to work going forward. You know, there's just no choice. We have to figure out how we're going to work this and going into the future.
Yeah, and just extending on your point, Terry, I think trying to understand where faculty thrive is another really interesting thing as the model evolves, because it's going to have to evolve. I've heard it called emergency remote teaching is what we were doing in March.
Yep.
What we're doing now is probably less emergency, but it's not particularly thought out. It's more like this massive like lab experiment is happening right now, and it's so. The good news is it's so decentralized and fragmented that like every flavor of intervention is going to be out there. I think the question is, how do we figure out what works?
Right.
And how do we figure out how to then really leverage what's best in our faculty so that they're really given the opportunity to thrive, and they're also given the opportunity to get the supports that they need.
Right.
Can either both of you maybe just weigh in a little bit on how you think we might be able to support faculty through the crazy times that we're living in?
Go ahead, Megan.
I was just going to say, well, let's see what Terri has to say.
Yeah.
I think an understanding that it is stressful. It's more stressful for some than others. Some that have more of an aptitude for the technology, it's less stressful. And it's not just the technology too, though. It's, those who, really thrive on, connecting with the students in the classroom and things. There's a void to that. So I think it's just an understanding and an empathy. That it's different for everyone. There's been a lot of changes, but the resources, you mentioned the resources too. So then the resources are different. We need, some of us need more tech help. And then, at libraries too, we don't need, we don't have our cases on at the desk at the library anymore. Everything's online, but we need help, more digitally help with research projects and things using more digital resources than going over to the library and looking things up, so to speak. So I think you're right, and I think some of that's going to continue. I think we're as Terri said, there's not going to be a going back to normal. Right. But as we go forward, some of these things are going to be adopted, and I think those are some things like the digital and the online resources things are going to become more and more important.
Yep.
Yeah. I agree. And we are out of time. We're actually a little over time. Thanks for those. Everybody's hung with us. So thank you so much. And I'll just add to what Megan just said about supporting faculty is that, we have to listen. And it's a two-way street. So I know a lot of faculty are frustrated and upset with administrators, and administrators are frustrated and upset with faculty. And we really need empathy is critical here. I put a plug in there for my book on radical empathy. But it's really, it goes both ways, because if the faculty can help and understand that the administrators are under sometimes more stress because they're trying to keep these institutions afloat, and the administrators can understand that the faculty are under huge amounts of stress and dealing with situations they've never had to before. It's just it's a two-way street, and I would love to see more discussion about how we can come together and really work together.
Yeah, and fortunately, we have a forum here to have those types of discussions, which is great. So
excellent.
And Megan, if folks want to learn more about anything, your research, or they want to learn about any recommendations where they should go, what they should look for?
Sure. I didn't. Well, they can get in touch with me, I guess. That's really all I have. My email is my name, Megan.Nocivelli at nichols.edu.
Awesome.
Nichols, Nichols.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being our first guest. You were amazing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks so much for inviting me. This was great to be a part of.
Yeah, and for those who are watching, this is recorded, of course, so we'll be posting it, and it's also on Facebook Live, so I'll be posting it on Facebook and everywhere. And actually, we're going to we'll put it into our podcast as well. So
yeah, and let us know what you like. Let us know what you want us to talk about. If you have suggestions for guests, if you want to be a guest, we're open to suggestions. We just feel like this is going to be a critical time to have these types of conversations, and we're planning on being here right through November. So thanks, Terri. Terri, you were that's our first season. We've been picked up for our first season. But,
we're waiting for the sponsorship for the second season.
Yeah,
exactly. But thanks to you, Terri, too. Like, we got one under our belts. Congrats, good job by us. Thanks to everyone who was able to help get this thing going. And any parting thoughts, Terri?
No, this was actually, it's really fun. I do enjoy this, and thanks so much to everybody and thanks especially to Megan.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. And with that, I'm going to hit the button. We'll be
All
back
right.
again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.